All right, good to have everybody here this morning, and all you at home, welcome. I saw your posts on here. I can't respond to them, but welcome to you all at home as well. So, all right, we're going to go ahead and begin in prayer this morning. Ken, you want to lead us in our opening prayer?
Dear Father in heaven, we just really appreciate the fact that we're able to call you our Father, and we just thank you for the love that you've given us over the years, through the years, and continuing on in our lifetime and beyond. And Father, we just thank you for the time we had to spend together with one another in the Word and worship later on. And Father, it's always a blessing to be here. We thank you for those that are able to come. We pray for those that aren't able to come. Pray for any that be sick. Pray forgive us when we sin, and I just thank you for once again for the forgiveness that you've given to us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. All right, so I'm going to take the next couple of weeks, and I'm going to be bringing some lessons on faith. And the reason I decided to do that, so this morning in Bible class we're going to talk about faith, and I'm going to have a sermon on it as well. And the reason I decided to do that was an article I came across the other day that was published in JAMA, J-A-M-A, which is the Journalistic American Medical Association, under psychiatry. And there was an article that was published, and I'm not going to get too much into it right now. I'll give you some highlights because that's going to be in my lesson. But it was published on the benefits of regular attendance at religious services. And this is coming from the psychiatry community and their view, which, you know, is kind of odd when there is and I may be wrong on this, but I believe a majority of those in those type of professions often refer to and look at religion as a crutch, something that is not beneficial to you, that holds you back from being who you really should be. And so I found it interesting when I read this article of what they're suggesting in it. And so I'm gonna bring up some of the things that they said in my lesson this morning and talk about that. But dealing with this idea of faith and why faith is so important to us. The article wasn't written so much in line with COVID-19. It was a previous study that was done, and then they expounded on it and said, is there application to this, to what we're seeing today, because of what they refer to as deaths of despair. And it's a terminology that was coined in referring to people who die from self-inflicted issues, suicide, but alcoholism, drug abuse, opiates, right? They call those deaths of despair. And so in the study, they concluded that there was a quantifiable difference between people who were religiously active and those who weren't. Now, I'll say this, the study comes directly from dealing with medical professionals. So what they do is every year they have this survey they send out, and it's a rather large survey. So we're not dealing with, you know, how you see polls where they say, well, we polled 1,000 people and Americans agree. I don't know how 1,000 is equivalent to 300 million, and somehow that means Americans agree because the poll says, and they polled 1,000 or 1,200 people. This was actually over 100,000 people, and it was 100,000 medical professionals. So this isn't dealing with the general populace, it's dealing with people who deal with situations of illness, mental illness, physical illness, and so forth. So they every year, I suppose, I think it's every year, they do a survey, and they ask them, one of the questions they ask them is, do you attend religious services on a weekly basis, or how often? They give them 3 choices. And so they took those numbers, and there's a lot of other factors that goes into this. And I posted the article on our Facebook page. So if you want to go read the entire article, It's very academic in its presentation because they got a lot of within there. There's a lot of information that's intended because it's in a medical journal, so it's intended for people to say, "Oh, we can accept this because these are all the formulas and the models they use." So they list all that stuff out. But as you go through there, you find, and they actually open the article with 3 bullet points, and I'm going to bring those up in the sermon this morning. But I posted that because I wanted people to take a chance to read that. And this is the one thing that they didn't do, though. They didn't answer the why question. And that's not their job. Their job is just to investigate the statistics and then conclude this from the data that they have, right? And so in the lesson, and what we're going to talk about this morning, I'm going to answer the why. And that is why, and what they concluded in their lesson, or in their study, what they concluded in their study was that in a significant number, people who attended religious services, and they didn't qualify whether or not it was Christian. It could be any, right? It was just religious services. That they actually had a less likelihood of deaths of despair, and so I thought, well, we need then to understand faith, because it's not just the fact that you attend. There's something behind that, right? There's something real behind that, and so it's important for us then to understand why it is that people who attend religious services, in fact, have a less likelihood of suicide, alcoholism, opiate addiction, and so forth. Now, that doesn't mean that none do, but a less likelihood that they will end up having a death of despair because of those things. And it's rooted in faith. It's rooted in faith. And not just faith in anything, right? I mean, as Christians, do we have faith in everything? You do? You have faith in your government?
You do?
You do not, Ken. Don't even tell me that you have faith in your... Now, Ken will be coming this morning for lying, and publicly, he just said it out like, yeah, I do.
I have faith they'll do the wrong thing almost.
Okay, you have faith they'll do the wrong thing. Okay, he qualifies it, so you're all right. All right. So no, we don't just put our faith in anything and everything, right? It's based upon evidences. We want support. We're not just going to commit our life to this if we don't believe that there's some type of support for it. It's not just a wishful thinking. It's not just, hey, I need something to get me through my day, so I'll choose Christianity. Because as we know, Christianity can be a very tough walk. Why would you choose something to get you through your day that in many instances makes your day more difficult because of people who ridicule you, people who abandon you, those type of things. So it's not always an easy course to take. And so for people to say, oh, well, it's just a crutch, then I think they're missing the point on that. So what is this faith then? And how would we define it so as to establish the reason we commit our lives to this Christian faith? So we had done a series of lessons a couple of years ago, and on the one-word study, the book, the one-word study. And so I went back and I revisited, and there was actually a study in there that we did on faith. And so I'm going to be going off of the study that we had done in the past. And this study was put together by David Phillips, and then I went through and amended and put things in here that I wanted as well and added to it. But I want to make sure that we give credit, because that book is still out there. You can still get the one-word study. It's a good book. There's a lot of good information in there, and it's beneficial. So when you take a look at the word faith, a metaphor, apropos to belief in the promises of God, is the scene in the extended allegory of the Pilgrim's Promise by John Bunyan, where the characters Christian and hopeful are trapped in a doubting castle, a prisoner of giant despair. It is only because hopeful remembers that he has the key of promise, which unlocks the dungeon door that enables both to escape. Bunyan's remarks at the bottom of the page are intriguing. Precious promise. The promises of God in Christ are the life of faith and the quickeners of prayer. Oh, how oft do we neglect God's great and precious promises in Christ Jesus, while doubts and despair keep us prisoner. Well, in my lesson, my sermon this morning, I'm not going to talk about faith in Christ. I'm not going to go there yet. Our faith begins with not faith in Christ, but a belief that God even exists. That's the foundation. If we don't accept the existence of God, then how do we accept the existence of Jesus? How do we accept, as the Son of God, how do we accept the sacrifice that he made for our sins? How do we accept eternal life? We need to first lay the foundation that there is a God, right? And then we move into, well, since there is a God, where do we move from there?
I like what he said about despair keeping us a prisoner, because while you're in despair, there's no door that you can see.
Yeah.
You are locked up, and it takes, it's difficult sometimes people to see what the door actually is.
That's a good point, because as Ken's saying, when you're in despair, it's difficult for you, if not impossible, for you to see a way out, right? Because you're consumed with the despair. And the despair has other effects on you, like what? Is that what? I can't hear you.
Your health.
Your health. It affects your health. So if your health is affected in despair, what do you end up doing?
Getting sick.
Okay, you get sick. You don't get out. You become depressed, right? You lock yourself away. You don't open yourself up to those things which could pull you out of despair. You're just kind of imprisoned into this area. And then fear comes in. With despair comes fear. When you're in a place of despair, then you begin to question the purpose of life. What am I here for? What is even the reason to live? What am I accomplishing? And I hear that sometimes, and I don't mean to say that it's a moment of despair for people, but there are times, and I'm sure most of us, if not all of us, have experienced this with some older people who will question, why am I still here? They'll say that. Why am I still here? Well, I'm very old. What do I have to do? What am I still doing here? And that question, though, can begin to steamroll into a place of despair because they find no purpose for their existence. I can't do what I used to do. I can't get out like I used to get out. And so because their activity in the world becomes diminished, then they begin to despair as to their purpose for existence. And one of the things in the study that is brought up is that when people lose reason and purpose in life, then you have deaths of despair. They don't have reason, they don't see reason for living anymore. And so it's just as easy just to end their life. Some will do it rather quickly through suicide. Others will do a slow process, alcohol addiction, opiates. They'll do a slow process, and then eventually they'll succumb to this effect. So in looking at this idea in the Pilgrim's Progress, where the characters Christian and hopeful are trapped in a doubting castle, the only way of escape for them is promise, right? The promise. But the promise has to be something that is real. It has to be tangible. It can't be a wishful thinking promise. That doesn't sustain us. And I'm being cautious here because I don't want to get too much into my sermon. But if your faith in or your trust in a promise is something that is often a disappointment, right? You believe in somebody, you believe they're going to do something, and time and again, I have it all up here, time and again, you find disappointment, then you can see why you might fall into a place of despair, because there's really not a real outcome that you see that's going to be positive for you. So when it comes to our faith, we have to know absolutely that it's not just a wishful thinking, that the promise is based upon something that can deliver, will deliver, actually exist. It has to actually exist. Or these two people stuck in this dungeon have no real hope of escaping because what they believe in is just a myth. It's not real at all anyway. So they're just trying to believe in something to give them some relief. But in the end, they know that what they believe in is not real. So you don't really have any sustainable relief in that. It may be for a moment, but soon enough you realize we don't have any real hope. So whatever it is, and in this case faith has to be real in order for it to have an actual quantifiable effect on us. You can't believe in something fake and actually have it alter your life in any sustainable way. And I'm getting ahead of myself here because that's in my lesson, or at least part of it is. So when we look at escaping despair, how do you escape despair? How do you get out of it?
Get out of yourself.
Okay. You get out of yourself. Stop what?
Stop thinking inwardly and start thinking outwardly about other people, other things, other than yourself.
Okay.
The problem is you're concentrating on yourself and your issue only. You put a wall there between you and the outside world. You need to break through that wall.
So you become self-focused, and that self-focus. Now, the reality of that self-focus, what leads you to that place of despair, it may be made up. There are times that people go into places of despair off of false ideas, right? Even when we look at what was going on around us and what still to some degree is, people went to extremes, not based upon actual facts, but perceived outcomes, right? You have a perceived outcome. 2 million people are going to die tomorrow. So you have a perceived outcome, and it creates a despair, whether that's a reality or not. In your mind, it's a reality. But in many cases, the despair results from something that actually does exist. It's a real thing that's happening on the outside, and it affects you inwardly. So either way you go, it's something that's affecting you. And so what do? As Ken said, you begin to focus inward. Sometimes it can be self-pity, sorrow, right? Just not wanting to deal with anything, so you just lock yourself away. In order to come out of despair, the solution has to be real. It has to be real. The solution to bring you out of despair cannot be something made up, because you'll know that. And if it's made up, you'll realize that it's made up, and you'll say, that's not a solution to my problem at all. That's just a fake made up thing. So here's the reality. If it's an imagined problem that's led you to despair, you have to come to the reality that it's imagined. You have to recognize that you really have made this up. Oh, so there's a real solution. Or the reality is, whatever it is that's holding you there, you have to come to understand that it can't harm you the way that you think it will. It won't affect you the way that you think it will. Point in case, people today are becoming less and less afraid of COVID-19, and you're seeing more and more people coming out. Why? Because whatever level of despair they may have been in has been diminished by the reality of, well, look at the numbers in Arizona, look at this, look at what people are saying, this here, this there. And so they begin to loosen up. And so there's something real and tangible they can hold on to, and so it pulls them out of that despair. Faith then has to be real, a real thing, for it to have a real effect on us. It can't be a myth. It can't be a myth, because sooner or later you're going to realize it's a myth, and it will have no sustainable effect on us. So there has to be something real about it. So for these individuals, in this book that are stuck in prison, it can't be a wishful thinking. It's just faith. It's just faith. Faith. What is faith? A belief in God. Okay. Does God have to be real for faith to exist? Well, I can tell you, some people will tell you no, it doesn't. He doesn't. He doesn't have to be real for faith to exist. You can have faith in something that's not real, and it actually affects you in some way. But I'm telling you, it will not affect you in a sustainable way. It may have a momentary effect on you, but sooner or later, you're going to come to realize that what you put your faith in isn't real, and then what are you going to do? You're going to abandon that. You're going to abandon. You're going to be like, okay, why would I stay with it? I know it's not real.
It'd be like putting your faith in the government.
Yes. Yeah, sooner or later you realize, I got to do that. Yeah, I'm very cautious when I do that, right? So when we take a look at faith, what I'm trying to get across in defining it then is that faith is something, it's not just belief in something, it is actually a belief in something or someone that is real. That is real, sustainable faith. And when you go back and look at the definition of faith, in fact, I believe you see that. And I say especially so when you see the impact it has on our lives. There are people sitting here who have been Christians for 40, 50 years? 70 years. 70 years. Michelle is 85 years old. Her whole life. So some people were brought up in the church. They've been committed to this faith. Well, with all the push against faith, all the smart people and scientists and everybody that's telling us that you're believing in a myth, why haven't you accepted it? Are you just that stubborn that for 70 years you would hold on to something that the evidence is so overwhelming that you're just completely blind and you needed a crutch for all these years just to live day to day? There has to be more than, I'm just being stubborn, I'm going to hang on to this for all these years. And it can't be enough that it's real to you. That's not enough. It actually has to be real. It's like today you hear this expression, my truth. I love that expression in that I hate it. Okay, so you know how that works. I love it that I hate it. Some expressions you just go, really, my truth. But your truth may not be the truth. Unless, of course, you don't believe that there is a truth, thus the truth, that everybody has their truths, right? So as long as your faith is real to you, that's all that matters. No. It can't be just real to me. It has to be real whether I accept it or not. It has to exist in order for me to actually put my trust in it. So going back and looking at how this word is used in the Old Testament, the word translated in Genesis in chapter 15, let's take a look over there, 15 and verse 6, is Aman. And I'm probably mispronouncing the Hebrew word because I mispronounce English words, so I'm probably not getting that one correct either. But in Hebrews chapter 15 and verse 6, it says, speaking of Abraham, and he believed in the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. So Abraham believed. Now, the question then, in trying to define what faith is did Abraham have a faith in someone? Here, it says that Abraham believed him, and he believed him, or believed the Lord. Was the Lord not real? Well, it was real to Abraham. Well, Abraham, the story of Abraham, if we accept it as historical fact, and that's the way I will approach it, if we accept the story of Abraham as historical fact, he altered his life based upon this belief. He abandoned his family heritage, put himself in all sorts of trials and danger, was willing to even sacrifice his child, Isaac, based upon this belief. Now, if this faith of Abraham is simply his faith in someone, the Lord, who didn't exist, then how would you refer to Abraham? What would be his condition be mentally? If Abraham is just he's going to sacrifice his son. What kind of mental condition is that?
Determined.
He's psychotic.
He saw God working in his life. It wasn't just a far-off dream. He actually experienced God correcting him.
Yes. So, if his faith is in a made-up individual, Lord, if it is just his mental disparity that's brought about an invention of someone to bring him out of that, a crutch. My life is so horrible, I need a crutch. I'm going to invent someone, I'm going to call him the Lord, and I'm going to go where he tells me to go. Except when you look at his actions, his daily life, what we have recorded, is not the mind of a crazy man. He plans things out. He raises a family. He's a businessman. He never shows any signs of being a lunatic who's going to go and just kill his child because he believes in something that's not real. Granted, there are people who do that. There are people out there who said, the Lord talked to me and this is what he told me to do. But what you find about those people is generally they have mental instability. It's been recorded over time that there were already issues in their life. We have none of that with Abraham. We see a man who has faith in the Lord. That faith that he puts in the Lord is not something that he just made up. It's not faith in someone that doesn't exist. I believe in order for Abraham to do what he did, the Lord has to be real. And not just real to him. Not just real to him. Because he moved his family. He got Lot to go along with him. Right? So it wasn't just him. He was affecting all these other people with him. So faith is described, when you take a look over at Abraham, it carries the idea of loyalty as well. Abraham's actions were loyal to what God wanted. Now, that's when you talk about it being quantifiable, when I use that word, or tangible. I believe that's how you see faith as being quantifiable or tangible in how it's carried out. And I'm in lessons to come, I'm going to talk about that. How you see, and I think Hebrews chapter 11, that great example of faith that we have, the chapter of faith, it really demonstrates how you quantify faith through the actions of the people who had faith. So those actions, some of them were extreme, like build an ark. That's an extreme action, but it demonstrates something. What was Noah so crazy, so out of it, that he would take his wealth, all that he had, and invested in building this giant ark over a made-up character? I believe you'd be hard-pressed to prove that. And not only that, but the multitude of characters that you have that were willing to commit their life, willing to die, and so forth. So it shows, real faith shows carries the idea of having loyalty. Abraham's faith would remain loyal to God in the midst of the testing of his faith in obedience. The idea of sacrificing his son, even the idea where he tells him to get out of the land of his father, to leave his family behind. That is a loyalty, to leave behind his family and to go somewhere else. There's another word that's used 49 times in the Old Testament, and it describes the idea of faithfulness. Faithfulness. The word indicates the idea of one who is righteous, a righteous man carrying out the works of the one that they are committed to. Now, You can be faithful to your spouse, right? How do you demonstrate faithfulness to your spouse? If you're faithful to your wife, what's one thing you don't do? Cheat. Yes, Michelle. If you're faithful to your wife, you don't cheat on her. If you commit adultery against your wife, then you're not showing loyalty. You're not showing faithfulness, right? You're not showing, if you want to break it down even further, belief in the relationship. I don't believe in this relationship. I don't believe it's what I need. I don't believe it's what sustains me. I don't believe it brings me peace. I don't believe it brings me hope. How do you show that? Well, because I'm cheating on you. I'm trying to find that somewhere else. I'm certainly not finding it here, so I'm going somewhere else. So faithfulness in relationships can be qualified. We can see how you're faithful to someone else. You're loyal to them. You protect them. You listen to them, right? That's faithfulness. You help them. You're concerned for them. That's faithfulness, or part of it. So in the same way, when we go back and look at God, faith is not just merely an acknowledgement that God exists. It is actually something that's tangible, something that's carried out, faithfulness, something that's lived out. And I believe that when you begin to see a life that is lived out in accordance with the one that you have faith in, then it really brings to the forefront the idea of a faith in something that's real. Now, I know you have people out there that live out of faith in belief in fairies. They believe fairies are real, and they go and do all of these things that they think shows that fairies are real. The problem with that, and this is where I want to clarify the difference, is that there is no evidence whatsoever that fairies exist. There is no evidence whatsoever that mermaids exist, that unicorns exist, that all these other things that people put their faith in, there's no evidence that they exist. But on the other hand, there is evidence that God exists. Where's one great piece of evidence that God exists? The creation itself. And that's what Paul says in Romans in chapter 1, that the creation is the evidence of God's existence, his invisible attributes, his divine power, his eternal nature, or he says clearly seen through what has been created. Nothing out there proves to me that fairies exist. So these people that dedicate their life to being fairy people, when the only time they've seen a fairy is when they've been on some psychotic drug, right? Mushrooms or acid or something. Maybe they've seen it then. But in the real world, they've never seen that. But they build their life around it. That is not faith. That's not faith. Biblical faith involves a belief in one who is actually real. That's real faith. It's not faith when you're believing in something that cannot be proven to exist. In the New Testament, when we look at this idea of faith, the noun form is pistis, and it describes a process of believing in, and here's another part, trusting in God. When you look at loyalty, does loyalty involve trust? Yeah. Loyalty involves trust. If you're going to be loyal to someone or something, then you have to trust that whatever's been laid out for you will actually deliver on what it is that you've put your trust in. In the English, the word faithful suggests the idea of being full of faith, right? So when we say, are you faithful? It's being full of faith. The idea that there's not something there that creates a lack of faith. You're full of faith because the evidences allow you to be full of faith. If there was reason to doubt the existence of God, if there was some evidence that suggested or proved that God did not exist, then I could not be faithful. There would be something that would be creating doubt in the existence of God. And it can't just be because some smart person who's a scientist told you that God doesn't exist. Oftentimes, That is the extent of the evidence. Oh, well, you know, I've got 39 degrees and I teach at such and such university, at this university, at this university. And if I tell you that God doesn't exist, you would be wise to listen to me. But you've given me no evidence. All you've said is because you think you're a smart man, what you say actually has validity to it. A lot of smart people say a lot of dumb things, right? Just because you're smart doesn't mean that you actually have the answer to everything. Sometimes the information you have is skewed. Sometimes all the information that you think lines up and points to this reality is actually not correct. That you have accepted yourself and believed things yourself that have led you to this conclusion when actually there was no evidence to it at all. But on the other hand, as Christians, we don't just accept that God exists because the preacher tells you, the elder tells you, your parents tell you, because that's not faith. That's not your faith. That's not a faith in God that you develop. Each individual has to accept it and be loyal to it and trust God because they themselves know that he does exist. You, as an individual, know that. It's not a collective. Well, because we're all sitting here because you all believe, I guess I should believe too. No. You see, that's the way oftentimes you find it in the realm of science. Science will use these arguments. All the smart people believe this. All the real scientists accept this. So if real scientists accept this, and if all the smart people accept it, you do well to accept it as well. And if you happen to be one of those people, you would be the foolish man not to accept it when everybody else around you is. But that's not the way it works in the Christian faith. We don't accept it because the group accepts it. We accept it as an individual based upon what? The evidences. In fact, if you go back and take a look at Abraham, he would have been foolish to do what?
To leave where he was, start with.
Yeah. Because everybody around him wasn't accepting the God that he accepted, or at least his family. So if he was going to go along with the crowd, but his faith was based upon his individual experience, what he heard, what he saw, what he went through. And so his faith is built on that, not on what a collective is or is not accepting. So when we take a look at the idea of being faithful, we would use it to mean maintaining faithfulness, being continually, God being continually trustworthy, continuing or us continuing to be a believer.
Abraham's faith was built on the same thing ours is, the Word of God. You got a Word from God, you believe. We got a Word from God in the Scripture, we believe.
Yeah. Yeah, and when you go back and you look at what we believe about God, there's a lot of different avenues you can take to support a belief in the reality of God, faith in God. When you look at the tools that are used, the weapons that are used to fight against the Christian faith in God, the unreliability of the Bible, right? The Bible's not reliable. So why would you believe in God when the Bible's not reliable? But if you actually take the time to do a study, and many people have written books on this and done this, you find out that the text is reliable. That just because some smart person at college told you it wasn't, didn't mean that it was. That didn't mean that he was correct or she was correct. So we have evidences that support that, the historical nature of the Bible, the scientific facts within the Bible, the prophecies and the fulfillment of them within the Bible, the fact that the creation, that we are here, that we exist, we came from some place, we got here somehow because we are here. What's the answer to that? And our faith is not just simply a belief in just a wishful thinking or a mass collective of agreement because, hey, we all just kind of agree with this. It's based upon evidences, and those evidences shore up our acceptance of this being God, being real, and this being his word, and Jesus being his son, and what he said and what he taught to actually be the case. We don't just wishfully think that and say, hey, I need a crutch. I guess I'll just believe this because there's nothing else out there. Why are so many people drawn to the concept of Christianity in the first place, or religion at all? I mean, if you're going to debunk Christianity, if you're a scientist and you're going to say Christianity is a myth, you have to label all religion a myth. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what it is. You have to say the only thing that is tangible, quantifiable, is material. That's it. That's right. It's all we can put our trust in. So this other stuff, and we're not just going to deny Christianity. We're going to deny any belief in the spiritual altogether, based upon what evidences. What is the evidences that lead you in that direction? You ever hear the statement that science disproves the existence of God? Do you know why science doesn't disprove the existence of God? Because science doesn't study God. Science cannot disprove what it does not study. And since science does not believe in the supernatural, it doesn't even venture into the supernatural. All science can prove or disprove is the material things that it studies. That's it. So when someone starts telling you, hey, science has already proved that God doesn't exist. No, it has not. Because you're telling me science proves something it has never even studied. And then that's really putting faith in something that has no validity to it. So science is a needed tool to look at the elements, to look at the things around us, and to understand them. There's nothing wrong with science. It just doesn't venture into the realm of the spiritual because that's not what it's designed to do.
And many times they think they proved something and later on they found out, well, that wasn't true.
Yeah, they find themselves to be wrong. Over in Jude, we're given this idea of the direction of our faith, right? What is it that we have faith in? So in Jude, verse 3, beloved, while I was making every effort to write you about our common salvation, I felt the necessity to write to you, appealing that you contend earnestly for the faith, which was once for all handed down to the saints. When we're talking about faith, and I believe this is going to go back to, well, I know it does, it goes back to the study, the Harvard study. This actually was a study done in Harvard, the one I was talking about. It goes back to the Harvard study that when you talk about what leads people out of despair, there has to be something concrete there, right? And one of the things that they mention is the reason they believe that religion affects people in a positive way, in that they are less likely to have deaths of despair, is because religion generally teaches a life of wellness, mentally and physically. The idea of abstaining from certain things that would harm you physically. Whereas, and the mental concept of love your enemies, be forgiving, right? So, and we know that those mental things can affect us physically and lead to despair, depression, and death. So, in religion, typically, the idea, and again, they're just taking this, they're not doing it from a theological viewpoint at all. They're not doing it from the perspective of Christianity and that there's a God. It's just religion. The idea that because that way of life instructs us to live in a particular way, then we have a less likelihood of being a casualty of a death of despair. Well, when you go back and look at what Jude is saying, in Jude, we're seeing this idea of what? Contend earnestly for what? The faith. Not a faith, the faith. That word, that phrasing there, and he says, which was delivered once for all. That the concept there is a system of what we would refer to as a system of justification. The faith. It's not many faiths. It's not any faith. It's the faith. So there is a particular system of belief that we have, a particular system of practices that we have, a particular one that we believe in, right? All of that is into this faith. And it's because of that system of faith that we sustain. Not because it's wishful thinking, but because it actually exists. Not just the belief exists, but the one that is believed in exists. And so we place our faith and we follow that system, thus are less likely to then find ourselves in a death of despair. All right, so we'll stop there, and then we'll pick up in the sermon. I'm going to break down faith just a little bit more and get a better understanding, bringing in that article. All right, we'll be back in a minute or a few minutes.